Then we test extension at the shoulder by asking the patient to extend his arm against resistance like this, and at the same time palpating the extensors of the shoulder. We repeat the test on the opposite side. Then we test flexion at the shoulder by asking the patient to flex his arm against resistance. We proceed then to examination of the motor power in the lower limbs. We start by examination of the plantar flexion of the toes. We test plantar flexion of the toes by asking the patient to plantar flex his toe against resistance while fixing the foot proximal to the joint tested, like this. We repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test plantar flexion of the lateral toes by asking the patient to plantar flex them against resistance while fixing the foot proximal to the tested joint. And we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test dorsiflexion of the toe by asking the patient to dorsiflex his toe against resistance, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test dorsiflexion of the toes by asking the patient to dorsiflex them against resistance while fixing the foot proximal to the joint to be tested, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test plantar flexion of the foot by asking the patient to plantar flex his foot against resistance while fixing the leg above the ankle joint, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test dorsiflexion of the foot by asking the patient to dorsiflex his foot against resistance while fixing his leg above the level of the ankle joint. We repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test flexion of the knee by asking the patient to flex his knee against resistance, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test extension at the knee joints by asking the patient to extend his knee against resistance, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. Then we test abduction at the hip joints by asking the patient to abduct his lower limbs against resistance. Then we test abduction at the hip joint by asking the patient to abduct his thighs against resistance. Then we test flexion at the hip joint by asking the patient to flex his thigh against resistance, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. We can also test flexion at the hip joint by another method, by resting the patient's leg on our forearm and asking him to flex his hip against resistance like this, and we repeat the test on the other side in the same manner. Then we test extension at the hip joint by asking the patient to extend his hip joint against resistance like this, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. We can also test extension at the hip joint by another method. We ask the patient to lie in the prone position, and we flex his lower limb at the knee and ask him to raise his thigh or to extend the hip joint against resistance, and we repeat the test on the opposite side for comparison. We proceed then to examination of the deep reflexes. We start by examining the deep reflexes in the upper limbs. The commonest deep reflexes routinely elicited in the upper limbs are the brachioradialis reflex, the biceps reflex, the triceps reflex, and the finger reflexes. The brachioradialis reflex is done while the upper limb kept in a position of flexion at the elbow joint in an obtuse angle of about 120 degrees, and the forearm is put in a position of slight pronation, and we tap upon the brachioradialis tendon while observing the contraction of the brachioradialis muscle and the tendency at flexion of the elbow joint. We elicit the biceps reflex while the arm kept in the same position. The biceps reflex is elicited on the right side by putting the index finger upon the biceps tendon in the cubital fossa and tapping our own finger while observing the contraction of the biceps muscle and the tendency at flexion of the elbow on eliciting the reflex. We repeat the biceps reflex on the opposite side by putting the thumb upon the biceps tendon and tapping it with the hammer while observing the contraction of the biceps muscle and the tendency at flexion of the elbow. The triceps reflex, on the other hand, the triceps reflex, on the other hand, is elicited while the patient's arm kept in a position of flexion at the elbow with an angle of 90 degrees or less, and we tap the triceps tendon just above the olecranon and notice the contraction of the triceps muscle and the tendency at extension of the elbow joint. We repeat the reflex on the opposite side by putting the arm in the same position and supporting it just under the elbow joint while tapping the triceps tendon just above the olecranon and noticing the contraction of the triceps muscle and the tendency at extension of the elbow. Then we elicit the finger jerks by intermingling the patient's fingers with our own fingers and tapping upon our fingers and noticing contraction of the flexors of the fingers. We repeat the test on the opposite side in the same position this way. Then we proceed to examination of the deep reflexes in the lower limbs. The commonest deep reflexes routinely elicited in the lower limbs are the knee reflexes and the ankle reflexes. The knee reflex or knee jerk is elicited while the patient's lower limbs kept in a position of flexion at the knee joints at right angle or obtuse angle and supporting both lower limbs upon the examiner's forearm, put in the popliteal fossa and tapping the quadriceps tendon between the patella and the tibial tuberosity. While observing the contraction of the quadriceps muscle and tendency at extension of the knee joint. We proceed then to examination of the ankle reflexes or ankle jerks. Ankle jerks are elicited while the lower limb is flexed at the knee and externally rotated, and we hold the patient's foot, dorsiflex it, and tapping the tendo Achilles while observing the contraction of the gastrocnemius muscle and the tendency at plantar flexion of the foot. We can do it this way, or we can do it while putting the foot on the opposite leg like this, and we elicit the reflex this way. We repeat the reflex on the opposite side in the same manner by flexing the limb at the knee joint and externally rotate it at the hip and dorsiflex the foot while tapping the tendo Achilles tendon and observing the contraction of the gastrocnemius muscle and the tendency at plantar flexion of the foot while eliciting the reflex. Then we proceed to examination of the superficial reflexes. The commonest superficial reflexes examined routinely are the plantar reflexes and the abdominal reflexes. In some cases, we might do cremasteric reflexes, corneal reflexes, and conjunctival